This time next week, Democrats, freshly propelled by sales so full of energy and genuine enthusiasm, will begin the process of formalizing what is self-evident. They will make Vice President Kamala Harris officially the party's standard bearer. She'll take up that mantle, having already assembled a mighty and fired-up coalition as formidable as it is diverse. Just in the last few weeks, the Harris-Walz appeal has cut across all demographics, reaching voters of all stripes, some of them previously turned off or tuned out. And this is what they are hearing.
Unlike Donald Trump, I will always, I promise you, put the middle class and working families first.
I just made a very clear observation that they seem to be really concerned about. I pointed out that taking away reproductive freedoms, banning books, raising the price of insulin, trying to hurt labor unions, nobody's asking for that weird crap. No one's asking for it.
Someone who suggests we should terminate the Constitution of the United States should never again stand behind the seal of President of the United States.
Now, these rallies are, those are not the highlights. The rallies are sustained energy, sustained enthusiasm, sustained punchlines and applause. And the vice president and her running mate's gravitational pull, unsurprisingly, is now extending well beyond what Democrats typically think of as their winning coalitions, all the way out deep into Republican territory. Many of those Republicans deeply disaffected by the MAGA movement. We have called them Never Trump Republicans, people who recognize the existential threat posed by the disgraced ex-president, and those small few who understand the concept of publicly putting country over party. These Republicans out in the country have spent nearly a decade now out on the margins, supporting Biden in 2020, but otherwise biding their time. Well, now they seem to have found an unlikely new champion, a disciple of Barack Obama, a vice president to Joe Biden, a standard bearer for their one-time rival party. Former Georgia Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, a lifelong Republican, has already endorsed Vice President Harris. And David French added his voice. He's a leading voice of conservatism. He submitted this opinion article to the New York Times. Quote, "The only real hope for restoring a conservatism that values integrity, demonstrates real compassion, and defends our foundational constitutional principles is not to try to make the best of Trump, a man who values only himself. If he wins again, it will validate his cruelty and his ideological transformation of the Republican Party. If Harris wins, the West will still stand against Vladimir Putin, and conservative Americans will have a chance to build something decent from the ruins of a party that was once a force for genuine good in American life." And then there's the Republican mayor of Mesa, Arizona, a lifelong Republican. Listen to what he said at Kamala Harris's rally on Friday night.
The Republican Party has been taken over by extremists that are committed to forcing people in the center of the political spectrum out of the party. So I have something to say to those of us who are in the political middle. You don't owe a damn thing to that political party.
You don't owe a damn thing to that political party. The crowd went wild. You could practically reach out and feel the crackling energy infused by Vice President Harris and Governor Walz just in the last 72 hours at these huge rallies in city after city. The Harris-Walz ticket is bringing that roaring approval from the crowds that swell to 15,000 people, with people not getting in, waiting outside, so full of life and energy and purpose that Donald Trump, after first attacking it, now literally refuses to believe what he sees with his own eyes. The man whose first act as America's president was going to the CIA and lying about crowd size did it again this weekend when he falsely suggested images of jam-packed Harris rallies of the size of her crowds were AI generated. Trump, who made news today for simply scheduling a rally in the midst of a Where's Waldo period of his 2024 campaign, is now left to join some of the rest of us, sitting back and seeing just how far and how high the Harris-Walz ticket will soar. Joining our coverage, that's where we start today. Joining our coverage are some of our most favorite experts and friends. Distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude is back. Also joining us, Democratic pollster and president of Brilliant Corners Research, Cornell Belcher is here. And former senator and co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill is here. Cornell, stipulating that Vice President Kamala Harris describes herself as the underdog in this race. You did that in that big, huge rally in Philadelphia. And that the country is pretty closely divided in terms of how they self-identify. There is no denying what is before our eyes and what we can hear with our ears at these events, and that is that the Harris team has all the momentum. The Harris campaign has changed the structure of the race, and there will likely be, and I want to hear your opinion, but I imagine sort of a political dogfight for battles of momentum. But in terms of structural changes, it doesn't feel like there are a ton of opportunities to reshape the race. What do you think about where the race stands today?
No, I actually think there's a ton of opportunity to reshape the race. And look, as someone who worked on, 08 and 12 Obama campaigns, where I think we expanded the electorate and certainly expanded the political map in a profound way, I think the Harris coalition has an ability to even be larger and grow that. I mean, look, they're already expanding their paid media and their time and attention into more battleground states. And I think that's the key thing here is, they're not going to be sitting around on election night waiting for the results of one state to come in, which was something David Plouffe famously said of us in 08. They're expanding the map. So they're bringing more states into battle. And look, the Republican thing is interesting. In 2020, Donald Trump garnered 94% of the Republican vote, and so you see that is there opportunity now to garner more of that Republican vote? I don't know, but I certainly think that Republicans, like you've talked about here, coming out prominently, speaking against Donald Trump in a way that we've never seen Republicans come out and talk against their nominee, opens up a whole nother door, an opportunity here for Democrats to make even more inroads. And look, and if you look at the way Democrats are winning college-educated white voters, particularly college-educated white women. Look, in 2012, we were not winning college-educated white voters like this. So I think the playing field and the coalition opportunities now are actually larger than we saw in 2012. So I think that the Democratic coalition, or at least the Democratic coalition, little d, and those who believe in democracy, I think can grow, Nicole, in a way we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I forget who said it first, but to the point you're making, I'm not sure that polls capture the movement of the pro-democracy movement, because I've kept a close eye on Republicans because there were like 4 of us in 2015, and the rest were sort of in witness protection. But this David French piece is so interesting because it's not just I'm disgusted with Trump, we should get rid of him. It's an intellectual argument for the heart and soul of pro-life evangelical conservatism. Let me read a little bit more to you on this point about reshaping the race, sort of beyond which states fall into battlegrounds and you add a trip to. I think there's an opportunity to have almost like generate, like the way there were Reagan Democrats for a generation and people remembered, their parents sort of switching parties because it was so seismic. I think there's an opportunity to have that, the inverse of that, and sort of like a Harris conservatives for this reason that I'm going to read you that David French sort of puts his finger on. He writes this, quote, while there are voters who are experiencing a degree of Trump nostalgia, remembering American life pre-COVID as a time of full employment and low inflation, there's a different and darker story to tell about Trump's first term. Our social fabric frayed. It's not just that abortions increased, the murder rate skyrocketed. Drug overdose deaths hit new highs. Marriage rates fell. Birth rates continued their long decline. Americans ended his term more divided than when it began. I'm often asked by Trump voters if I'm still conservative, and I respond that I can't vote for Trump precisely because I am conservative. I loathe sex abuse, pornography, and adultery. Trump has brought those vices into the mainstream of the Republican Party. I want to cultivate a culture that values human life from conception through natural death. Yet America became more brutal and violent during Trump's term. I want to defend liberal democracy from authoritarian aggression. Yet Trump would abandon our allies and risk our most precious alliances. You never, ever, 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 ever hear a prominent conservative articulate that Trump brought the specific vices of adultery and sex abuse into the mainstream, but that is exactly what he did. And I talked to you and Sarah Longwell now for months about permission structures. This feels like a new one.
It does, right? Because it's laying out the very conservative case against Donald Trump. And look, we've had this conversation on your show before. It's like none of us think Donald Trump is actually a true conservative. And so you have true conservatives stepping up and giving them a permission structure. And look, let's lean in and also give some kudos to Liz Cheney, who I think started this. Right. And sort of leaned into this. And I think she began giving them permission structure, and that tack on it, I think, is coming full fruition now.
There has been a lot of focus lately, and for good reason, on the huge crowds, all the packed arenas across the country that are out there, all the people supporting the Harris-Walz ticket. We're showing you some of the footage there. And these crowds tell us, of course, that people are excited. They're energized. And Trump's reaction to these crowds has also told us a lot about him. I mean, after Harris-Walz filled yet another arena in Michigan with a sea of very real, alive supporters, the former president of the United States and Republican nominee posted a statement on social media, and I'm going to read it to you in full, because seeing it is one thing, but hearing it is another. I'm also going to tell you why. So here it is, quote, "Has anyone noticed that Kamala cheated at the airport? There was nobody at the plane, and she AI'd it and showed a massive crowd of so-called followers. But they don't exist. They didn't exist. She was turned in by a maintenance worker at the airport when he noticed the fake crowd picture, but there was nobody there. Later confirmed by the reflection of the mirror-like finish on the vice presidential plane. She's a cheater. She had nobody waiting, and the crowd looked like 10,000 people. Same thing is happening with her fake crowds at her speeches. This is the way the Democrats win elections, by cheating. And they're even worse at the ballot box. She should be disqualified because the creation of a fake image is election interference. Anyone who does that will cheat at anything." Those are Trump's words. He posted them. Now, if a friend of yours or someone in your family posted that on social media, you'd be very concerned. I mean, you might even try to get them some professional help, like right away. But this is not your older uncle or your neighbor who's losing it. This guy wants to be the commander-in-chief again. Here's what Harris campaign senior advisor David Plouffe tweeted. Quote, "These are not conspiratorial rantings from the deepest recesses of the internet. The author could have the nuclear codes and be responsible for decisions that will affect us all for decades." And he's right. I mean, one of the biggest stories of this presidential election right now should be that one of the candidates is spewing unhinged conspiracy theories, usually reserved for the darkest corners of the internet. Now, on a personal level, this type of unhinged conspiracy spewing is something a person does when they are on some level quite disconnected from reality. They are maybe frankly unwell. But I'm not here to diagnose Donald Trump. I'm here to look at what is happening underneath all that crazy. Because when you cut through the craziness, the random capitalization that you might need help, like right now, vibe of that post, there is something perhaps more sinister happening here. I mean, if we're being generous and acknowledging there could be some level of strategy here, this is all part of Trump's sinister plan to undermine Kamala Harris, to prime his supporters to question the outcome of the 2024 election, to condition his base to not even believe what they're seeing with their own eyes. He uses words like cheater, cheating, fake crowds. This is all in this post. Should be disqualified. These are messages to his followers. Of course, this is far, far from the first time Trump has done this, even just over the past few weeks. I mean, take NPR's fact check of Trump's rambling press conference that was very hard to watch at Mar-a-Lago last week. They found that he lied a whopping 162 times in 64 minutes, which, by the way, is not exactly easy to do. And one of those lies that he repeated several times was suggesting that Harris's nomination is unconstitutional. Of course, as NPR put it, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about picking presidential candidates. And earlier this month, who can forget when Trump said that Harris happened to turn black? So basically, the crowds aren't real, her support isn't real, her spot on the ballot isn't real, her race isn't real. Don't believe what you are seeing. Believe me, that is what Trump is doing. And here is why. I mean, right now, he's looking at a race where his opponent is leading in 3 of the core swing states, raising a whole lot more money than him, holding a whole lot more events than him, and is about to go into an enthusiastic Democratic convention. Harris is doing really well right now. Doesn't mean it won't be a tough campaign. She's doing well right now. So Trump is looking for ways to delegitimize her support and even her standing on the ballot in an effort to call into question what could be a victory for her in November. In other words, reality isn't looking so great for Trump, so he is sowing doubt in reality. It's an old trick of his, favorite trick of his. Just ask Joe Biden. And it's happening again. So yeah, Trump is coming across as unhinged and unwell, and he may be both. But to the extent that there is a strategy underneath his incredibly concerning behavior, this, in my view, is it. Now, George Conway is a conservative attorney. Sarah Matthews is a former Trump White House deputy press secretary. I know they both have a lot of thoughts, and they both join me now. So, George, I'm going to start with you because you have not held back on Twitter. You never do. You never hold back in person either, reacting to this post from Trump. So don't hold back now. What does this post say about Trump and where he thinks he stands in the election?
He is a decompensating, narcissistic sociopath. He is a very unwell person. I've been saying this for years. If you go through you don't want to diagnose him, but I think if you look at the diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, he fits every single one of them. It's like the criteria were made to describe him, and we can observe that just from 1 week, but we've been observing it now for 7 years. And what happens to these characters, and these are the type of people who become cult leaders, authoritarian dictators. These kinds of people ultimately go too far and they destroy themselves. And when they reach that point of no return where they're basically spiraling, they become delusional and they can become psychotic. And I think what we saw with this tweet yesterday is that last final collapse of Donald Trump's mental state. I mean, you think about it, saying that those were like 50, 60, 70,000 people in the aggregate in five rallies in different states. Jonathan Chait put this of New York Magazine put it this way today. It's like, that's loopier than saying that the moon landings were staged, because there were tens of thousands of people were there, and there are hundreds of people taking photographs and videos. To think that is crazy and to try to sell it to people is just as crazy. He's done. His brain is fried.
So, Sarah, I mean, you can also add to anything George said. By all means, he kind of covered it there. But, I mean, I read that because I think it's important for people to hear, right? I mean, those are Trump's words. He posted them. No one's making anything up here. It's a lot for people to manage on the campaign. You've worked for him. What's going on there behind the scenes?
I think that he feels this election slipping away from him. And that's where you're beginning to see him spiral and cling to these conspiracy theories, as you noted, with the AI-generated crowds, which obviously can be easily disproven. And despite him claiming that there's this photo with, no reflection of the crowd.
Don't feel like you have to explain it.
I know. It's insanity, though. It truly is. And there will be people out there that will believe it, though, because he's pushing it. And that's what happens when he gets desperate, is he pushes these conspiracy theories. And not just this one. It's him kind of leaning into Kamala Harris's racial identity, or him even going after and attacking the popular governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and his wife. These are not winning campaign messages, but that is what he does when he feels like he's under attack, is he uses these kinds of lines of defense that don't make much sense for campaigning. I can assure you that his campaign team is telling him to talk about policy. They want him to go out there and talk about the economy and immigration immigration, and things that voters actually care about. Because I can assure you that none of these things that he's talking about in his rallies or his Truth Social posts are things that are top of mind for most voters.
No question about it. I mean, I know they say they want to talk about policy. That's what everybody says, right? And he's not, doesn't seem capable of that. So he seems very unhinged and all the things you said earlier, George. But there is sort of an underlying theme here, right? Which is him kind of questioning what the outcome might be. This is not valid. She's not valid. She's unconstitutional as a candidate, which is not a thing, I think you can confirm. Right. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the, other aspects of his efforts that that we should be concerned about. Instead of, we're just calling him unhinged, it was unhinged, but what else are you seeing in terms of his behavior and what they're preparing in that regard? I think you're right that he's basically preparing to say that the election was stolen again from him. And that's an old trick. I mean, even in 2016, he was saying that if he loses, it was going to have the election, that the election would have been stolen from him. That's something that narcissists do. Mm-hmm. They basically blame others. They can't accept their own faults. They can't accept defeat. So they basically came, you cheated. He cheated. She cheated. Everybody cheated. Didn't happen. And he's reaching to the point where, and it's for him, he's not very smart. But he has a reptilian intelligence, and that reptilian intelligence tells him to do that, to deny reality and to get other people to deny reality. But this time, he's really gone over the edge. Yeah. And because he's looking at he's not just running for president. He's running from prison. He's already a convicted felon. If that case in Florida ever goes to trial, he's going to get convicted, and he's going to get convicted down the street. Because the Supreme Court's immunity decision only goes so far to protect him. He's looking at prison. He could go to prison for the rest of his life, and he is terrified of that. Which means, and I agree, it means that he is maybe more desperate, perhaps, than he was even in 2020. Then it was about which is scary. Winning an election. Now it's a little different. And I think everybody remembers this, but just to reiterate, you quit the administration after January 6th because of what you saw. That was, of course, the culmination of all of this in 2020. What is it like to sit and watch? I mean, there's pebbles of details here we're seeing, the way he posts things, his preparation to question the outcome, to lead up to something similar. Yeah, we saw this happen in 2020 where he started questioning the legitimacy of mail-in ballots. So he was laying the groundwork ahead of the election to then say that it was fraudulent. And obviously we know that there is zero evidence of that. And then after the election, he kept clinging to even more crazy conspiracy theories because his advisors were telling him what he didn't want to hear, which was that he lost and there was zero evidence of fraud. Mm-hmm. So then he started listening to people who were telling him what he wanted to hear. And as George noted, I am concerned about how he is going to be more desperate heading into 2024 to ensure that he wins, because I've long said he is not running to make America great again. He is running to stay out of prison. And so if he doesn't win this election, then he's scared of what will happen as a result. And I think we're not talking about enough the things that his campaign is saying, too. Mm-hmm. Even one of his top campaign advisors, Chris LaCivita, recently said that the election will not be decided on Election Day. It will be on Inauguration Day, and when Donald Trump swears his oath with his hand on the Bible. And a recent Rolling Stone investigation showed that there are 70 pro-Trump election deniers who will be playing a role as election officials in key battleground states across the country. That is terrifying, because even if there is evidence, or no evidence of fraud or anything to suggest that Trump won and Kamala wins, in 2020, then these people will be pushing the things that he wants, and that is their backup plan. So right now, their plan is to gin up the base, get them excited, and increase turnout, because it doesn't seem at all like they're trying to appeal to swing voters, because when you're talking about crowd sizes and racial identity and attacking Kamala Harris for that's not a winning message. So their backup plan, though, is to default on claiming that this election was stolen or rigged, as they did in 2020, but it's going to be even more extreme in 2024. Those are such good reminders, everything you listed. I want to play, so George, I want to play a portion of an ad that your PAC, Anti-Psychopath PAC, your name, not mine, is putting out on cable starting tomorrow, because it's really interesting. People should see it. Not enough people want to go to his rallies anymore.
They want to go to Kamala Harris's rallies. Enjoy the rallies while they last, Donald, because where you're going, you're not going to be able to have any.
First of all, that's your voice.
Yes, it is.
I mean,
I missed my calling. I spent 30 years practicing law. I could have been doing TV voiceovers.
You could have a future. Yeah. I mean, look, I think watching that, the crickets even. Are you trying to drive him crazy? Is that the goal of those ads?
No, I mean, our whole point, I mean, my anti-psychopath pack has basically 4 objects. One is to point out his mental disorders. Second is to explain why his mental disorders are dangerous for the country. Third is to get the media to talk about it, because I think the failure to talk about the fact that he is mentally disordered, and every psychiatrist you ever talk to or psychologist will tell you that behind closed doors, has normalized him. We are just, he said a lot of insane things before yesterday. And all of a sudden we have to wait for the most insane thing at all to say, oh, wow, he's crazy. It's like we've gotten so used to the craziness that it takes something like saying 50,000 people or 70,000 people weren't there for people to start maybe talking about it.
Well, we're talking about it. We can't get numb to it, George.
Right. And the fourth thing I want to do is to provoke him into demonstrating those qualities of insanity that he tends to go
well,
and he has already responded to one of our ads.
If he sees that ad,
by attacking Fox News and Fox,
Stay tuned. If he responds to this ad over the next hour, we will tell everybody. George Conway and Sarah Matthews, always really enjoy talking to you both. Thank you so much.
When we mobilize, nations change. And when we vote, we make history.
It's true, no matter how you vote. And we are now turning to a special report and panel discussion on this historic barrier that Kamala Harris has smashed, the first black woman to ever be a major party's presidential nominee in America's 248-year history. You see her standing out on this list of recent nominees, and of course it goes all the way back with her trailblazing campaign, now driving enthusiasm from our world of politics all the way to culture as it caps a long fight for representation.
Show me what democracy looks like.
I stand before you today to proudly announce I am now officially the Democratic nominee for President of the United States.
That is as strong a start as you could ask for.
I think she's going to win. She seems very smart, very educated. She's vice president, and she'll do good.
Not going back can mean a rejection of the policies that have oppressed so many people in recent and far-gone history. It can also be a call to go forward towards a more enlightened and diverse leadership in this country, in contrast to the status quo. And while the color barrier fell at the White House now over 15 years ago with Obama, most racial breakthroughs have come through male leaders, reflecting how men held most leadership positions in the establishment and the civil rights movement alike. When the major leaders of most civil rights groups were gathering in the 60s and 70s, here's one such gathering, you would see a type of diversity, but you would also see all men, a template that's extended later in politics as some of those very successful and qualified leaders moved into politics and office. Take activist John Lewis, who went from civil rights work to becoming a congressman and really a national figure in the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris recently shared this image of her literally looking up to the late Lewis as memorialized in this mural. There is a great appreciation for what he did, but the barriers that were broken and the path that he paved from the civil rights movement into politics came out of that group I showed you, of men in civil rights. There's a different history for black women who also played a role in civil rights and activism and organizing, like Ella Baker.
I have had about 40 or 50 years of struggle. I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done.
Takes all that and more, and if it takes organization, Those women who, as I'm reminding you, were in the struggle were not necessarily always given the organization or backing to then go directly into politics or business or other extended activities in American life. Those women faced more hurdles than men in politics. In total, black women may have made up 55 congresswomen and 93 mayors in America. And while voters do know Harris's candidacy is unusual, many people do not realize there have been very few times when Americans have had the opportunity to vote for a black woman in any top statewide offices whatsoever, the big positions in the states of governor or senator. Take the Senate's current composition: 89 white senators, 3 black men, and no elected black women. That's the composition of the Senate after Harris left. No black women left there. And she was only the second ever black woman to serve as senator. Now take the 50 governors. Right now, in America, 46 white governors, 1 black man, and 0 black women governors today. Indeed, there has never been a black female governor in the United States, ever. Voters may choose to end this color line at the White House, in other words, this year, before it has fallen in a single governor's mansion in a single state. That is a stark sign of just how rare Harris's bid is. As a black and Indian American woman, she's following the path of others who have broken barriers, like Dalip Singh Sand, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and Carol Moseley Braun, that first black female senator I mentioned before Harris, who also ran for president.
Breaking barriers, building bridges, bringing people together. I have been blessed to be an agent for change and progress.
Somebody's got to do it. It's not an overnight process. Just as Jesse Jackson registered voters and began a path for Obama all the way back in 1988, we can see that now. Harris allies know that Shirley Chisholm launched a then long-shot bid for president all the way back in '72 after years of bluntly confronting how, as she put it, quote, white males controlled policy and people's lives.
I feel that the cabinet and the department heads of this country must have women, must have blacks, and not be completely and totally controlled constantly by white males.
That was then, but as I've just shown you in the facts, that is also largely now. These historic milestones can also transcend partisanship, which is very important. We need civil rights breakthroughs totally separate from the endless red-blue debates. Former Congresswoman Mia Love was the first black woman elected to the House as a Republican, a good thing. Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, the first woman of color to take that post in Virginia. And beyond elective office, we've also seen black women rise in appointed leadership positions. Presidents in both parties have tapped leaders like Condi Rice, Susan Rice, Loretta Lynch, Linda Thomas Greenfield. President Biden cemented a big part of his legacy for picking not only Harris, but the first black woman to ever serve on the Supreme Court. And that's in comparison to the 108 white men who have held those jobs in the court's history. The numbers show how rare and significant this moment is, and that's regardless of your gender or political affiliation or who you want to vote for in November. It's a big deal. Now, many people cheered Reagan putting the first woman on the Supreme Court. That is a diversity pledge that he made in advance, just as Biden took this next step and pledging to put a black woman on the court. It is a type of DEI. It is a well-known fact that Ronald Reagan brought that DEI approach to staffing the Supreme Court as a Republican. Fact. Now, that's the context for this moment in history and our discussion tonight as Kamala Harris runs for the White House. She won her first federal office the same night that Donald Trump won the presidency, and then rose quickly to be on her party's ticket in the very next presidential cycle. And along the way, she has invoked this long historical path of black women fighting and sometimes rising in civic and political life.
Kamala Harris will replace fellow Democrat Barbara Boxer as the next U.S. Senator from the Golden State.
Have now confirmed that Secretary Clinton has conceded to Donald Trump.
There's one star who hasn't been talked about tonight who is going to be talked about a lot, and her name is Kamala Harris.
Women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality and liberty and justice for all. including the black women who are too often overlooked, but so often prove they are the backbone of our democracy.
What Donald Trump is offering in terms of policy is as radical a departure from normal American politics as anything that has ever happened in any of our lifetimes.
Tonight I reflect on their struggle, their determination, and the strength of their vision to see what can be unburdened by what has been. And I stand on their shoulders.
What can be unburdened? And how do black women, as Harris put it, look at this next effort to calcify that backbone she mentioned so that we might have a pluralistic and imperfect democracy that improves? As you can see, we are here gathered in a special. We have not only some special guests I'm about to show you, but in a room here we have on the walls a lot of the experiences and the history that we want to learn from and that may yet inform the future. For this special discussion, we are joined by Maya Wiley, who's known for many things in her civil rights work, but in this context, a black woman who recently ran for mayor in New York, finishing second. That's America's largest city. Donna Edwards, the first black woman to represent Maryland in Congress. Lori Lightfoot, the first black woman mayor of Chicago. And we'll also ask about Kamala Harris's push to break the highest glass ceiling with a historian from her own alma mater when we return.
Today, we got even more news about Project 2025 from ProPublica. This time, they are reporting that not only does the Heritage Foundation have a plan to remake America and a resume database for volunteers, but they also have masterclass-style video tutorials on how these folks can outwit bureaucrats, hide information from the public, and implement their radical agenda without accountability.
I think you can expect that equity and all of the equity executive orders under Biden will be repealed early in the next administration. This is going to require a very detailed plan to execute the eradication of the dictates in the equity orders.
It's definitely giving those creepy videos from Lost. But what Kate Sullivan, Trump's former acting assistant attorney general, is talking about is how MAGA Republicans want to get rid of any federal policy that treats minority communities like the LGBTQ community with respect or equity. The root of this determination is these conservatives' belief that being anything other than straight is oppositional to, quote, families comprised of a married mother, father, and their children, which Heritage calls the foundation of a well-ordered nation and healthy society. Kevin Roberts, who runs Heritage, expands on what it means to root out equity, writing, quote, pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children has no claim to First Amendment protection. And those who discuss it are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women, unquote. Project 2025's specific plans for the LGBT community are deeply rooted in Christian nationalism, and they're grotesquely cruel and bigoted. Simply put, they don't respect this community. They don't want to see you. They don't want to hear about you. And they certainly do not believe you deserve any special protections. They plan to rescind any regulations prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics, including by rescinding moves by the Biden administration to extend Title IX protections. That's the civil rights law that prohibits educational institutions receiving federal funds from discriminating on the basis of sex or gender to include LGBTQ students, too. They want to create a national version of Florida's Don't Say Gay policy. They want to criminalize educators who create safe environments for all kids. And finally, while they do not explicitly say that they want to reverse the Supreme Court ruling that made marriage equality a constitutional right, they do explain how Republicans can undermine it by eliminating any federal policies that promote LGBTQ equality or policies that exclusively assist single moms. Joining me now is Chase Strangio, co-director of the ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project. Chase, great to see you. Tell me, I've given a few of the sort of highlights or lowlights. What about this section of Project 2025 keeps you up at night?
Well, thank you, Joy. And I would say that
all of Project 2025 keeps me up at night, and it's very difficult to parse it out because it is a fundamental assault on everything we understand to be true about the structures of our government and our ability to advocate for ourselves as communities that have faced discrimination and marginalization. I will say I want to really pull out one of the first things that you put up on the screen, which is that Project 2025 is very fixated on trans people, really highlighting the outsized role that we have in the far right's imagination. But one of the things that is so chilling about this document is the way in which it talks about equating transness with pornography. And this really is the extreme manifestation of the groomer discourse and everything we've seen percolating in the far right media for a very long time, and then implementing that into policy by then saying that purveyors of pornography, which in essence includes just trans people existing, should be imprisoned. So if we think about what that means, it's setting the stage for a whole community of people, my community of people, to be targeted, surveilled, and imprisoned just for existing. And so I think we really have to sit with what that means, because that's at the core of what Project 2025 is saying.
Yeah, and they use this terminology, sexualizing children. I see a lot of like the Marjorie Taylor Greens and using that. But what they mean by that is just saying there are gay people or saying there are trans people. That is what they mean when they say sexualizing children. And so they're using this sort of protecting children motif basically to say, we just don't want you to mention that lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans people exist.
And they don't want us to be around children. And this really harkens back to the Anita Bryant Save Our Children campaign. This is the idea is LGBTQ people are inherently sexualizing by existing in proximity to children. But of course, we are parents, we are teachers, we are parts of all these communities. And so what does that mean when you have a vision of government that situates us as a threat to others and to children specifically? It authorizes the power of the government to start to criminalize us, to start to target us. And that's really what's at the core of this document.
Let me just put up, there's a map the ACLU put up that tracks 527 anti-LGBTQ bills just in the 2024 legislative sessions around the country. You can see Florida showing up there, a lot of southern states, but Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, et cetera. But some of the things that they're talking about doing in Project 2025, including expelling transgender troops from the military, expelling people living with HIV from the military, ending the Department of State's LGBTQ equality initiatives in Africa, where there are some really horrific laws against gay people, ending the anti-discrimination rules in the Affordable Care Act, essentially stripping LGBTQ people of any protection of law, period, and even the ability to serve their country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a combination of the worst of what we've seen in the states, federalized, where those policies can be federalized, and then exclusively federal policies like reissuing the trans military ban and restricting the ability to have foreign aid to entities that even talk about LGBTQ people around the world. So it is a really chilling document for what it means for our communities. And it does things like suggest that parents who consent to medical treatment on behalf of their children are child abusers and threaten to authorize the removal of those children like we saw in Texas. Really the worst of everything that we've seen at the state level. But one thing I just want to be sure to say is that all of these assaults start with trans people, but they reach cis people.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It never stays in one community. Discrimination travels. Chase Strangio, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
It is called, say it with me now, Project 2025, and it has become a point of central discussion in this presidential election year. It's because this playbook was designed for Trump, came out of sort of Trump world, but it also is because it outlines policies that voters, as a general matter, really don't want. So this was created for Trump by people associated with Trump. Trump, now realizing how unpopular it is, he keeps trying to distance himself from it, saying he has no idea who these people are who wrote this thing. Unfortunately for him, here he is on a private plane with the guy who's in charge of it. His running mate, J.D. Vance, is also pals with the Project 2025 guy. He just wrote a foreword for his new book. Then there's this over at the AP a few days ago. Former Trump administration official teasing the fact that he is currently writing the super secret transition playbook that Trump will use if he's reelected in November. This guy planning the transition. You will notice the headline offers a helpful reminder that this isn't the first playbook he's written. The guy planning the Trump transition is a, quote, Project 2025 architect. 6 of Trump's cabinet officials collaborated on the drafting of the Project 2025 playbook. Another 140 Trump administration staffers had a hand in working on it in some capacity. Right? All of that put together makes it a hard sell for the Trump campaign to claim that they had no idea who these people are who wrote up this thing. And that was before this happened. ProPublica has now obtained and published 14 hours of training videos put together by Project 2025. They're essentially tutorials for members of the future Trump administration. And the videos are interesting to look at in their own right. But for the Trump campaign, trying to say that no Trump people have ever had anything to do with this, they've never heard of any of these people, they don't even know where this thing came from. For the Trump campaign trying to make that case, these new videos are not going to help them make that case.
Hello, my name is Jeff Small. I was a presidential appointee in the Trump administration.
My name is Caroline Levitt, and I am a former political appointee in the Donald J. Trump administration.
I served in the Trump administration.
Pam, you started on day one of the Trump administration, and you stayed until the final hour.
Yeah, shocking that I made it.
Oh, poor Pam. They must have really put her through the ringer. Of the 36 different people who appear in these videos that are obtained by ProPublica, 29 of the 36 of them are people who directly worked for the Trump administration or the Trump campaign. We have fresh new polling today from UMass Amherst, painting a very clear portrait of why the Trump campaign continues to try to pretend like they have no ties to Project 2025, no matter how unsustainable that claim is. Part of the findings of this poll are that even people who voted for Trump in 2020, they, by clear majority, say they do not support the policies in Project 2025. The same poll also took a snapshot of the electorate since Biden dropped out of the presidential race. Back when this poll was taken in January, Trump led Biden nationally by 4 points. With Kamala Harris now at the top of the ticket, though, she leads Trump nationally by 3 points. So a total turnaround there. And you're starting to see that same turnaround for Democrats in important swing states, too. Late last month, after Biden dropped out, Harris was tied with Trump in swing states, the swing states of Michigan and Pennsylvania. Trump was up by 1 point in Wisconsin. If you look at that same poll now, in all 3 of those states, Harris leads Trump +4. It's a turnaround. It really is. And it's nationally and it's in the important states. And what this means, if you're the Republican ticket, is you're going to need a new strategy. You're either going to need to turn this campaign around to make people like you more, or you're going to need to figure out a way to win in a different way. And I have been talking here on MSNBC with some urgency about this since around the time of the RNC, because of what I'm seeing as what clearly appears to be an emerging strategy for Republicans this year, which is to mess with the count of the vote, to have local Republican officials deny certification of the vote county by county. You'll remember in 2020, when the violent mob was sicked on Congress, they were there to block the certification of the vote nationwide. Well, this time around, they are professionalizing the effort to block the certification of the vote. They're systematizing it. They're starting with trained Republican officials at the local level in states all across the country so they can make a bigger swing at it this time. And I have been talking a lot about this on MSNBC. I hear from you guys a lot every time I do it. I've had a lot of feedback on this. But some real experts in this field are talking about it, too. Not just about how worrying this problem is for November, but also what can be done to stop it. There's an urgent new report on the subject that I have been talking about for weeks here. We're revealing it here for the first time tonight. It's from CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. It's called Election Certification Under Threat, a legal roadmap to protect the 2024 election, including from 35 officials who have refused to certify results. The report tracks this sort of burgeoning crisis across 8 different states so far, where, in fact, there have been dozens of Republican local officials who have been refusing to sign off on proper tallies of lawful votes. Is this a Republican strategy that holds any promise of essentially hamstringing the electoral count, of messing up the election and it's the administration of the election at the point of the counting of the votes, making official the vote tallies? Do they have any real prospects of messing up the vote in November using these tactics that they have been essentially test driving in states all across the country in lower profile elections. Joining us now is Noah Bookbinder. He's president and CEO of CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Mr. Bookbinder, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for the advanced look at your report. I found it really interesting.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I have been talking about this sort of with increasing concern for the last few weeks, because it looks to me like Republicans at the county level and now starting to be at the state level are test driving an effort that they're going to try in November to effectively prevent the election from being made official, to prevent the vote tallying to go forward in any sort of normal way. Do you think that is what they're trying to do?
I think it is absolutely a thing that is going to happen. I think that we've seen these county officials in multiple states attempt to stop the certification of votes in elections of, in many cases, very little consequence. And they were doing it essentially as a run-through for an election of a great deal of consequences, which is the one this fall. So I think there's almost no question that this is going to happen. And it seems to be happening in a way this year that is more systematic than it has in the past. So that's deeply, deeply concerning. I think the good news is that it's clearly illegal in all of these states, and there are steps that can be taken to effectively halt it in all of these states.
And you single out some of those in a way that I think is very succinct and helpful. You write about state election boards, secretaries of state, attorneys general, local prosecutors should, in advance of the election, explicitly tell county officials that they do not have discretion to refuse to certify the election. Warn them in advance that they may be treading into essentially criminal law territory if they do this. We've seen that happen in a couple of states already.
That's right. In Michigan, the Secretary of State and other officials have been very clear that, the law provides for legitimate ways to challenge elections if there are questions about fraud or questions about the count. County certification is not one of those ways. It is essentially a ministerial process. It's not a way to challenge results. And in Michigan, officials have told these county officials, you can't do this. And if you do, there will be consequences. And I think that both potentially could deter some of these people from trying this. And it also puts them on notice so that if they do try to disrupt the election and they are prosecuted or they are challenged civilly, they won't be able to say they didn't realize they couldn't do this. So that's something that we'd like to see in all of these states.
And again, we've seen it happen in Michigan, but we haven't necessarily seen that happen even in every state where it has already been tried, let alone in states where officials don't yet know if Republicans are going to try it. It does seem like there are sort of different tactics legally available to state officials in various states. In some cases, you can have a court essentially order public officials to do this. In some states, you can have the state election board take over the job of a county election official if they're refusing to do their job. In other places, you can have a local official removed. But there isn't the same playbook available legally in every state. It does seem like the one thing that every state could do right now is give advice to every elections board in the state, get it on record to every elections board in the state that they should not do this, and and it's not within their rights to try it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we've seen in different states a number of these different responses work. We've seen in New Mexico and Nevada where they've gone to court and gotten orders to ordering these county officials to certify the vote, and that's worked. But the reason why we're putting this report out is to say, here's the law in this state. Here's what can be done so that state officials can get out there and warn these folks and be ready to act. And in a lot of states, I think the signs have been positive. In a state like Georgia, it's very alarming because you have the state election board going in just the opposite direction. And even though the law is very clear, you have the state election board actually trying to say that county officials can refuse to certify. And that's definitely a place to really keep an eye on.